Hello and welcome to this edition of Google Firestarters podcast. I'm Neil Perkin, the founder of Only Dead Fish and the facilitator of Google Firestarters. So Firestarters has always been, as you know, about the areas of challenge and opportunity in the industry and facilitating debate around that. We ran over 60 live events over the course of around 8 years at Google. Of course, we've pivoted now to virtual with this series of podcasts. And so we're doing a series of short interviews with some of the most respected people in the industry, asking them the same 5 questions. So we're asking them, what's the best thing that you've learned in your career to date? What's the biggest mistake that you've made and what did you learn from it? Then what is your key insight for how marketing and advertising is changing? And we're also asking about the key prediction for the future of marketing or advertising. And then finally, what question do you wish that I'd asked you? And what's your answer to that? So, of course, Firestarters has always been about the interested and interesting people in the industry and giving them a platform. And so today's guest is no exception. Delighted to welcome Lindsay Pattison, who is the Chief Client Officer at WPP. So welcome, Lindsay. Would you care to just introduce yourself?
Yep, thank you very much. I love that expression, interested. Be interested and interesting. I think it used to be on my Twitter handle for a while as something to aspire to. So really happy to be here. I'm back at Sea Containers House. It's the 1st of September, and I'm trying to be in the office 2 or 3 times a week because we all try and work out how to get back to work with, I'm not sure what the phrase is, some degree of normality as we hope to ease and come out fully of lockdown.
Brilliant. So welcome, Lindsay. Okay, so our first question is around learning, and we always like to think there's lots of learning to be had within Firestarters, but we ran an event about 5 years ago which was focused on the key learnings that people had in their career to date. We asked about 7 people to speak on that. It was one of the best events I think that we ran. So we've included that question into our podcast series, and that's our first question. So Lindsay Pattison, what's the best thing that you've learned in your career to date?
Gosh, I've got 4 things, so sorry, hope that's all right, having thought about it. So the first I learned on an amazing course called X Factor, not the singing competition, WPP leadership course about 10 years ago with a fascinating woman, Charlotte Beers, who kind of blazed through the glass ceiling actually back in the Mad Men era. And she helped me think about this expression of getting in front of the work and really thinking about your personal brand. And the basic premise is that Tom, Dick and Sally all could present exactly the same 10 slides of PowerPoint. We've all presented a lot of PowerPoint in our time, but actually the client will only buy it from one of them. So the content is the same. So the idea is, the content is going to be good enough after a while. We slave over decks, documents, media plans, whatever it is. But actually, it's really how you show up, how you present the work, how you engage, how you pull people in, how you demonstrate the power of your own thinking in your persuasion and your argument. So that's why the client buys it from Sally, but not from Tom or Dick. So actually understanding, we spend so long thinking about the actual work, which is great, but really, as we all know, nonverbal, it's all about nonverbal communication or style or being in a room. Obviously being in a room is quite tricky now, but really thinking about you and what you put into the work, I think is a really powerful lesson. And when you are younger in your career, you don't really understand it, and it still can be frustrating when people think, but when someone else says something and people buy it, when you say it, maybe they don't. So that's one thing. I think the second thing is really understanding the power of connections, and people talk about, old-fashioned language would be networking. I think a better way of thinking about it, because networking terrifies a lot of people, is to think about the power of allies. So who are your allies? Who are the friends that are going to buoy you up, going to supercharge you, going to get you excited about that meeting? Who are the people within your own company who are there to support you and become your cheerleaders or your supporters? Who are mentors outside of your company that you think can help you progress in your career? Who are people that you want to go to for advice? What are the industry events you can go? How do you start thinking about building up a network of allies, all of whom help bring something different to you and your career? And of course, if you're kind of getting stuff back, you should be giving out as well. It's a two-way thing. So thinking about the power of allies. I think, it's kind of linked to the first point maybe, but that confidence is a superpower. So how you show up, how you put yourself into a room, whether you smile, whether you have energy and vigor, I think is an attractive quality. And I think clients are looking for you to have confidence in your ideas and your work. But it doesn't mean you have to be noisy. That cliche, we have 2 ears and 1 mouth for a reason. So confidence is a superpower, but think about that ratio. And then the last point, I had to do a talk for WACL Gather earlier this year, and it was around the 5 characteristics of high performing teams. And I got, and actually I chose the word dependability, which sounds like a terrible word. It sounds like, if you're dependable, it sounds like a really dull expression, but I think there's something incredibly powerful about being dependable. And I think clients look for a level of discomfort. You can be discomfort with your provocation, with your ideas, and with helping them think in a different way. But actually you want someone to be able to depend on you. So if someone says, I can depend on Neil, I can depend on Lindsay, and I talk about clients, the clients want to know that there is someone that they can call me at 11 o'clock on a Friday night because there's a crisis happening on a Saturday and they need my help and depend on me to do that. But also, when we've had an amazing time, we smashed through the business figures, actually you're the same person they want to go out and celebrate with a glass of champagne. So I think dependability isn't being dull. I'm going to reclaim that word.
I like it. Good. It's interesting because there's a bit of a theme sort of running through all of those, I guess, about the way in which you kind of show up, I suppose, what you put into the work, and the power of allies and connections, and that sort of point about dependability. And I suppose trust being really important to all of those things. Do you think there is as much trust as there should be or could be in the industry at the moment?
No, and actually I was doing some research, which I've got sort of had to scribble down in my notes to talk about later, but actually advertising, and I don't like the expression advertising, I think it's much broader in terms of what we do, actually has very low levels of trust as an industry. It's got better over the last sort of 15 years, but it's still not in a great place. And I think what's key is to have trust between agency and client, or agency, client and media owner, or that combination, that ecosystem of people that now you need to produce brilliant forms of communication experiences. But I think there's still a challenge with consumer trust.
Right.
So 2 different things, perhaps.
Yeah. Okay, good. So, of course, part of trust is about being open, and one of our questions is about that as well, which is about mistakes. And so the biggest mistake that you might have made in your career or in the industry, perhaps, what did you learn from it? Always good to talk about that. So that's my next question. So moving on to mistakes, what was yours?
Gosh, well, I'll do 2. I remember a terrible one when I was a media planner years and years ago, where I think miscommunication was the mistake. I think I had this terrible day and a half where I thought I'd overspent by about 45 grand on a media plan because I'd misinterpreted approval. So that was just a nightmare. So double check any approval. Get a PO would be an early one. I still had slight nightmares about it. It was fine in the end. But I think the biggest mistake, thinking more about career, is thinking that someone else is in charge of your career, because actually the only person in charge of your career is you. And I think, again, when you are younger or even when you're older, you think someone else is in charge. Your line manager, head of a department, the CEO, but actually nobody is in charge of your career other than you, which is why thinking about how you show up, thinking about those allies and those connections and having a broader level of interest is important, and taking control and thinking more laterally. It's very rare we ever really take the time to think about a career, which is why some people say actually being made redundant, it in the end can often be a blessing, because it gives you time to reassess what you really want to do. So I think don't mistake that anyone else is managing your career. You're managing your career.
So if you're talking to younger people in the industry, people who just joined the industry, perhaps that idea of taking responsibility for your career, what does that actually mean? What do you think they should be doing?
I think, I guess Firestarters, without doing a simplistic plug, is a good example. So back to your be interested and interesting. So how do you become interesting? You read voraciously, you attend events, you rock, and you have a point of view. I always say to people now, I think you're lucky in that we have so many platforms where, when I started out in my career, you know, we had industry Bibles. Trying to get a column or even a letter published in one of those titles was incredibly hard, whereas now people are desperate for content. And there's really no excuse for not being able to have a really clear and concise and interesting opinion out there, because you know, you build up a Twitter following actually very easily by following right people, by commenting, by adding value, by pointing to useful articles. So I think that's, you know, making sure you're using social media really well. Predominantly, I would imagine, I think within business, that would be Twitter and LinkedIn. But there's no, you know, you can easily do that.
I suppose it's about just having a point of view, isn't it? And not being backwards about sharing that point of view, perhaps.
Yeah, I mean, and you've always got a point of view. You've got a point of view just as a consumer. So you think you're interested in car insurance or flour, but you know, we all have to buy flour at times, and you know, most people at some stage will own a car. So there's always something. There's always some experience you can speak to, even as a consumer. So you don't actually have to be expert on everything. Or you could think about someone in your family. I think you can always bring in a more personal objective. You can caveat it. You know, that you're not a deep expert on how to bake bread, but actually you've read about something you've noticed in the supermarket. You know, we're lucky in that our job is so baked into culture and society, which we're all part of, that you should always be able to have a point of view on things.
Yeah, brilliant. And speaking of point of view, our next question is really about how the industry's changing, and what about your insight really into how marketing, advertising is actually not just because of COVID, of course, but in the context of many other things which are impacting the industry. So if you had to pick out your key insight for how things are changing in the industry, what would that be?
I mean, well, I guess the very short answer is I think we definitely should be talking about marketing, not advertising. Advertising is very limiting, so broadening out to communication in the most widest sense. And we at WPP, we would talk about communications and then experience, commerce and technology. And of course, all of those four things are interlinked. So communications are still, you know, incredibly powerful ideas based on deep insights that can connect brands with audience in meaningful ways and in channels at meaningful moments. So broadly, the bread and butter of the industry. And then experiencing, how do you have a seamless experience to make brands part of people's lives, creating more memorable engagement and driving better business results. And obviously part of that experience will be communications. Then commerce, how do you make it easy for our clients to sell within, you know, the ecosystem now available? So when and where consumers want to buy is far wider, and one could argue more complex than ever before. And again, part of the experience is you expect to be able to buy often when you've seen a piece of communication. So again, you see there's interlinks between them all. And then finally, technology, you know, making sure we're sort of leveraging the global technology partnerships, or thinking about the way that clients want to organize their own data, and understanding how we make that data useful in order to use those signals. And you kind of go back full circle to inform the communications to understand where to best communicate and how and why to make that experience helpful and interesting, because you've learned something about my behavior. And again, helping me buy. You know, these days we have a very short attention spans. If we can't buy something as a result of having done it, it's quite frustrating. So
yeah, I mean, it's so interesting, isn't it, how you know, really the role of agencies is expanding into those areas because of the convergence of you know, communications and commerce, and you know, the whole sort of data piece as well. So, and what does that mean, or what has that meant for media agencies in particular? So the moving into those new areas, developing new skills, competencies, but also I guess the credibility with clients to move into those areas as well.
I mean, I think you have to think about all the ways that a brand can go to market. So seamless experience, how is the customer journey connected? So an experience at in a supermarket versus on an Instagram feed versus using a product. So thinking about all of those, you definitely, specifically within a media agency, you have to be thinking about how are you using and harnessing data. So how are you using first-party data? What access can you get to your clients' first-party data? How is that useful in combination to third-party data and media signals you're getting? How do you combine hard with walled gardens, but how do you combine signals from any of the walled gardens with customer first-party data to inform and make your media plan not just more efficient, but much more effective, because you're offering a more personalized, effective message. Thinking about how you connect to buy, and also sort of proving how you buy. I mean, in the old days, ROI were either very, reasonably complicated, multiplicative, econometric models, but now actually we have more immediacy on sales results. So how do you think about both those immediate sales results actually combined with thinking longer term about the combination of different parts of the customer journey that have led to that final buy? So I think it's just, as you said, it's a much bigger playing field, and you have to have a good competency and understanding and interest in data and the signals of data. But I think most media agency planners and buyers were always pretty numerate with data. I mean, everyone always crunched through data. It's just in the old days you used to do it sometimes through books and calculators.
Yeah.
Free.
Yeah. I mean, do you think it's interesting that expansion, I think, it brings media agencies alongside many other types of agencies, doesn't it? And consultancies as well, of course, who are sort of moving into this space now. So do you think that media agencies have a particular advantage here, moving into these new areas from comms and media?
I think, I think media agencies have always been very adaptable and numerate or data literate. So actually, I think the expansion of those services, and I would say the media agencies have tended to evolve quicker than traditional, in inverted commas, creative agencies. And actually, I would imagine, I think probably if you were to go back, 7 or 8 years ago, actually, I think the role of an agency planner at a creative agency, they were sort of going, well, they used to be the ones that held and understood all of the client's data, and would often do a lot of number crunching in order to work out the business case. But actually, a lot of that now, because the amount of data available more immediately to a media planner, might sit in a media planner's hands. But I think things go full circle. I think most clients now have a blended team where people are sharing the same types of information. So I think those old sort of delineation of roles are less meaningful. I think you think about front of stage roles, so how you deliver ways of engaging and ways to extract value from a consumer, and then but you also have to be very aware and adept at kind of behind the scenes understanding the connectivity you need from a MarTech perspective to get the right data to think about the experience. So it's just a much wider, brilliant playing field for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, we've done several events, I think, really on that sort of balance between creative and data, I suppose, because it's two really kind of interesting areas, and there's lots of debate, which is quite polarized often in the industry, about the value of each one of those things. So where do you kind of sit on the marriage of creative and data? I mean, what's the opportunity here that you're seeing from the media agency perspective in that respect?
I'm not sure I can answer particularly from a media agency perspective, because I've been out of media sort of specifically as a discipline for a while. But I think the interesting challenge is, data still has to lead. The understanding of data can still lead to ideally unlocking an insight, which changes the way you think about a problem and presents an opportunity. So that would be the creative way of thinking about using data. And then there's a very literal way to use data, which is I did A and B and it equaled C, therefore I'm going to do the same thing again. Therein probably lies madness, but actually there's a more literal way to use data. And then there's probably also a role to take a step back and think about, what does that unlock, or how does that help you think about things in the future? What might be the longer term trends that allow you to make a leap versus making incremental gains? I think if you think about those two things, each are important, sort of incrementally creating efficiency and effectiveness, but also being able to take that step back and think and leap more creatively is important.
Yeah, that's. I guess I've had that talked about in terms of being data driven and data informed before now. So you've got both of those things, and do you think the this idea of like a big creative idea being at the heart of every campaign, and then you do the media off the back of the creative idea. And you're talking there about more concurrent working and the opportunity for creatives to work alongside data people, to work alongside media people. How is that changing the creative process and the advertising process then?
Well, I mean, I think simplistically, it's an ecosystem. It's fluid. It's a bit messy. It's less handing over the baton. So I think in olden days, sound very old, the media agency, if they had a great relationship with the creative agency, would see the brief, would probably input to the brief, would wait for the idea, and then would think about the channels, or there was broadly a media plan and then you'd fit it. But I just think things don't work in that way. I think there's more fluidity required from a client and more teamwork to be continually thinking about the short-term gains, but the bigger opportunities. So, thinking about right now, what matters right now, what are we doing now, and how are we optimizing now, what's coming next. And there's always a team that needs to be thinking about those things, because everyone has short-term business pressures, but there also needs to be thinking about the future, or the next and the bigger leap. So I think it's just a bit messier, but I think human beings luckily are messier. So, and I think a lot of people in our industry, I think the delineation, thinking about, that's why we don't really call them creative agencies. We have integrated agencies, you have integrated fluid teams. A media person can be just as creative as a planner at an integrated agency. So I think less rigidity about roles, I think, is definitely a key factor of today's ecosystem at an agency side.
Yeah, okay. And it's interesting you mentioned about short and long term there. I mean, there's obviously a lot of short-term business pressures, particularly right now. And so arguably a lot more pressure to kind of drive business results and use advertising and marketing to do that in the current quarter, rather than actually thinking about what's coming down the line. So how do you, working with WPP clients, how do you make sure that long-term view, or the opportunity that can arise outside of the current quarter is baked into the way in which you work with clients?
Yeah, I mean, so some of it is, as I said, you think about that 3-time horizon, now, next, future. And I think agencies have always done that. I just think now there's probably more of a focus on the now, because you can get the short-term results. And if you don't have short-term results, COVID, some stats I read, just at the weekend, that COVID has increased global business failure by 25% in 2020. And if you look at the stats, again, of the Fortune 100 companies, so if you look at the companies that were there in 2008 and you look 10 years later, 43% of them have gone. They've come out, they've churned out of that top 100.
Right.
So there's exponential pressure on those businesses to succeed. So you just have to be mindful of both. But I honestly think I think COVID has accelerated the focus on right now. But I think in our world, we've always had to think long term and short term. And there's a lot of stuff published on that balance of, we used to call it brand and direct response, and actually there has been a shift, and quite a significant shift, from say 60% brand to 40% direct response. And I think the number now is 55 direct response, 45 brand, something like that. There's some great work done by Enders Analysis looking at that probably about a year and a half ago. So I think there definitely is more of an emphasis on the short term, but you don't wake up one day and decide you suddenly want to buy a Mercedes. You've had some kind of brand longing build up over time, and there's an imbuement of what a Mercedes or ownership of a Mercedes might mean to you. So, beware the last click wins still.
Yeah, absolutely. And you mentioned about now, next, future there as well. So that brings us neatly to my next question, which is about looking at the future of the industry, really. So do you have a key prediction for the future of marketing, advertising, where it's going?
I think the rate of disruption will continue to increase. I mean, I love this concept of anti-fragility, and the fact that actually you need to, I think, embrace chaos is too strong, but be prepared to actually not only survive in in a world that is disrupted. And right now we've obviously got COVID, but we've also got, Black Lives Matter. And actually, I think that has a seismic change on culture and the industry, because our industry is indelibly linked to culture. So I think, learning how to flex and actually build your muscles to survive in a world of that's more fragile, I think is important. I think purpose. I think people started to get slight ennui about purpose, purpose fatigue. But I think brand purpose will evolve again, and I think that's really by everyone's an activist now. Consumers, maybe some of it is because they are frustrated. They've been in lockdown a long time in many markets around the world. But there's a and of course the rise in social media and the access to more information, but there is a desire for transparency, brand transparency, and beyond brand transparency, really about company transparency and company integrity.
Right.
So 83% of people in the US, we did looked at some research from a couple of weeks ago, really say they'll choose a brand based on how they have behaved, either through Black Lives Matter or because of COVID. And actually, many people, again, a vast majority in the 70s and 80s% were judging companies. So companies, and then within companies, there are brands on how they're treated employees during COVID specifically. Right. And now the focus is on how are companies, therefore brands, treating, what's their culture like? Is it toxic? Is it bullying? Is it inclusive? How are they being diverse by design? And I think there's a lot more demands. And I think, consumers are people and they are employees and they have friends. And I think for a company or a brand, their own employee ecosystem is as bigger and important a stakeholder as their customers are.
Yeah. I mean, it's the anti-fragility idea, I think, is a very powerful one, isn't it? So it's the idea, of course, of you're rebounding, I suppose, from challenge and becoming more stronger, I suppose, because of it, because you've learned from that situation. So what's the way in which you work with clients to help them to be anti-fragile? What does that actually mean for them, the way in which they work, the way in which they do things?
I think being more open. I think one of the key, if we're going to be positive about COVID, and there's a lot to be negative about. I mean, it's a tragedy, really, obviously in terms of the number of deaths and people affected by it. But I guess suddenly being open to just entirely different ways of working and behaving. There was still quite a large dominant culture of presenteeism. So your agency needing to work all the hours got sent, people being in the office, physical meetings, flying around the world, for a 2-hour meeting. Yeah. Suddenly everyone is very adept at using Teams or Zoom or Google Hangouts or whatever your video conference of choice is, and actually understanding what matters is the outcome and the output of your work versus kind of sitting somewhere together. So I think being open and understanding and knowing you could change. I mean, if you were to say to us in the start of March that 95% of WPP's employees could work from home with no disruption and actually increased client satisfaction during COVID because of our adaptation, our agility, our anti-fragility, and ways of working in totally new and unexpected ways.
Yeah.
I think we'd have been very surprised. So it's now, how do we balance some of that, what stays of that openness, that agility, versus actually where is there a benefit to more consistency or continuity or process. So yeah, it's a fascinating time. But I think being much more open, and you're seeing that with lots of clients and brands who are saying, actually, we're going to close down our HQ. Why are we paying for, or we're going to have a smaller HQ. We're going to be more flexible about how we work. When you come into the office is when you want to have conversations, and rich conversations with people, or idea sessions. There's no point coming to an office in an expensive part of London or Manchester or Edinburgh to sit and do Zoom calls or do emails. And lose 2 hours commute each way.
Yeah, quite. I mean, does that reflect in the way in which your clients are responding to ideas, perhaps, or working with the agencies in more open ways? Is it more collaborative somehow, or is it
I think it is super collaborative. Yeah, I think kind of the spirit, the British spirit, we're all in it together. Dig for Britain, wash your hands for Britain. But everyone being much more open and working as a team, super fast decisions having to be made. So therefore, handles, and actually back to one of your earlier questions, actually, I think a lot of building of trust during this period where the teams have become totally blurred. So actually, whether you're working at an agency or a client, or multiple agencies, whether they're different, not so WPP agencies, or working with all of our competitors. We've all got friends at all of our competitive agencies, but actually just working as a team to get the job done and be super agile, collaborative, fast, responsive. And I hope that we keep a lot of those behaviours moving forward.
Yeah, I was going to ask actually, because that is an interesting question to think about what's going to stick, once we're hopefully past this situation. So do you think this will have a long-term impact on the way in which clients work with agencies?
Yeah, I think in a very positive way. So I don't think you suddenly want every, if we think about traditional forms of advertising, every campaign to now, just because it can be shot and delivered and on air in a week, I don't think it should be. I think there is a benefit, as we talked about before, being longer term, being thoughtful about sort of those big Super Bowl moments, or the highly charged emotional macro moments where you want culture to kind of unite, versus having to quickly being forced to change things and adapt. But I think definitely more flexibility, maybe back to thinking about those horizons. What do we need to do right now, and then how do we carve out time to think about the future? I think what will stick is this idea, or the recognition of how you behave as not only as a brand, but as a company and organization, how you think about your employees as well as your customers or consumers, I think will really stick in a good way.
Yeah, that
ability on companies' shoulders and on CEOs' shoulders to be behaving in the right way. And I think finally, diversity inclusion, I think is fully at the top of most companies' agenda, and they will have to deliver. They will be held accountable.
Yeah, I think I agree. It seems to have been one thing that's really happened over the last 6 months is this focus on employee well-being, of course, and how companies treat their staff, but also the diversity inclusion has just gone right up the agenda. So again, do you think those kinds of things are here to stay? Is that going to stick, do you think?
Absolutely here to stay, and I think it has to start from the top, because a lot of the challenges are systemic, and they're either systemic or they are unconscious. Both of those things are very challenging. So you need to investigate both parts of it, because actually, if you think about diversity and inclusion, I would say here in the UK, we're actually not bad, particularly at entry level. When I look across our teams, we are really diverse. But it's a bit like the gender, and by the way, gender inclusion, gender equality is still nowhere there. It's the same. So we have equal mixes of men and women. Actually, when you look at our junior or middle levels of colleagues across the UK, we're pretty diverse, but it narrows. So what do we need to systematically put in place to enable that to change quickly? And how do we also need to make sure that we're losing any unconsciousness is no longer an excuse. You raise your consciousness and do something active about it as well. So I think both those things need to come to the forefront.
Yeah, good. Okay. So we're arrived at our last question, which is what's the question that you wish that I'd asked you, and what's your answer to that? So this might kind of catch your question at the end. So what question do you wish that I'd asked you?
So I thought about this. Quite hard, because I have to be so many things I could talk about, because I love our industry. But I think if you'd have asked me what's my favorite brand at the moment and why, or what company do I admire at the moment and why, that would have been a good question. So I will give you an answer of L'Oreal. And I admire L'Oreal for their ambition to be a beauty tech company, and for structuring their strategy and their talent around key pillars to achieve that. And I think when you talk to a lot of other FMCG companies, actually they will hold up L'Oreal as a great example of a client that is leading the industry and thinking about a more seamless customer experience using technology in a great way, making sure the commerce, so e-commerce, they've invested in D2C, partnerships with marketplaces, like Alibaba, partnerships with smaller e-retailers, and they've done that in a fascinating way, accelerated by COVID here in the UK. They're thinking about AR, so augmented reality. They acquired a company called Motiface, which was a Canadian startup, which powers a lot of their service design, innovation, and partnerships with Amazon and Facebook to scale that AR. They really led the way with, I know it sounds simplistic, but still revolutionary and much needed during COVID. You can't try makeup on. So actually, they've already got one of the best beauty apps for changing your hair color, your hairstyle, your makeup, and trialing everything online. And of course, you can then buy it. So the fact you can't go into stores and you still can't try any beauty products online, and there's no advisors there because of COVID restrictions, means they're ahead of the game. I think they do a really good job in terms of content. They think like a publisher. They've always worked incredibly well with influencers, and actually now thinking about micro influencers who become advocates, and how do advocates become mini affiliates. They've always been very thoughtful about data-driven marketing, thinking about the value exchange for customers. So, why should they share your data? And I think they do a really good job of working thoughtfully with startups and bringing them into the system versus just taking over them. But they work in France with Station F, which is one of the biggest startup incubators in the world, and they're the sort of beauty partner. So they're clever, I think, in that respect. And then finally, I think they have a great leader in Lubomira Rocher, who's the chief digital officer. So whenever I speak to her, I sort of come off going, she's so smart and so clever, and she talks about, I think her background is actually as an economist, so she thinks very laterally and very broadly, and is super smart. So she talks about this lovely expression of how do you get the dividend of loyalty. So therefore, you have to earn loyalty. So how do you be thoughtful? How you add, back to that, how are you adding value? How are you adding engagement? How are you making easy and seamless for someone to want to engage with you and think about engaging you in different and interesting ways? And I think she has a very healthy and balanced attitude to agency and client relationships and kind of mutual upskilling and mutual partnership. So I think they are a great company to look at for many reasons.
Yeah, it's an excellent example. I think your observation there about them becoming as much a technology company almost as they are a beauty company, and as much a publishing company as they are with content and so on. I mean, a lot of that requires a lot of mindset shift behalf of the client, doesn't it? So what do you think the role of agency partners is with helping that mindset shift? Do you tend to think it's like the client does the shift and then asks the agencies to respond and work in a different way, or is it the role of the agency to support or to actually create the impetus for that change?
It was interesting, actually. We've got a big leadership summit. Actually, God, I was going to say next month, but it's September, so this month. And one of our global client leaders, I loved the expression. She was thinking about how our relationship with this major client has changed, and she summarized it as, we've gone from answering the brief to creating the brief. That's our role. And I'll come back to that funny expression of dependability and discomfort. So being provocative, thoughtful. A lot of our clients say to us, don't try and over-know the client's business. The client is always going to know better than you are. But what you can do is bring your own deep expertise of advertising, marketing, experience, technology, data and commerce, thoughtfulness, an alternate view, outside stimulation or provocation. So bringing all of that stuff to help them think differently. And then that dependability comes into play, that trust, because then they will trust on you to find the right solution to help them deliver it. So ideally, you would be creating the brief, working with them to create the brief, not just answering the brief.
Yes, I really like that thought of dependability and discomfort. Side by side, that's a really nice thought. So that's brought us to the end. So Lindsay, thank you for that. That was amazingly insightful, as always. And so for all of our listeners and viewers out there, don't forget to subscribe, of course, to see more of the Firestarters podcast series. And thank you for listening and watching. And of course, my thanks to Lindsay Pattison for her brilliant insights. Thank you very much, Lindsay.
Thank you, Neil.